In 1829, some of the most respected reformers in America built what they believed was the most humane prison in the world. No beatings, no public humiliation, no chains, just silence. Complete, total, enforced silence for the entire length of your sentence. Within 10 years, the prisoners were going insane, and the people who built the system knew it. They watched it happen. They wrote it down, and they kept doing it anyway, for another 70 years, because the alternative forced them to admit something they weren't ready to face, that the thing they designed to heal the human mind was the thing destroying it, and that silence, stripped of everything else, isn't peace. It's a weapon. This is the real reason 19th century prisons banned silence, and the story of how they got there is one of the strangest, most consequential mistakes in the history of criminal justice. To understand why silence became a prison policy in the first place, you have to understand what American prisons looked like before 1820. They were, by every available account, catastrophic. Jails in cities like Philadelphia held accused criminals alongside convicted ones, debtors alongside murderers, children alongside adults. Violence was constant. Criminal networks formed and strengthened behind bars. Guards extorted prisoners for food and basic services. If you had money, you ate. If you didn't, you might starve. The reformers who visited these places weren't exaggerating when they described them as schools of crime, environments where whatever good a person had left when they entered was systematically destroyed by the time they left. The Quakers in Philadelphia had a solution. They'd been developing it since the 1780s, led by figures including Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of the signatories of the Declaration of Independence, a prominent physician, and a man who believed deeply that criminal behavior was a kind of moral illness that could be treated through the right environment. His proposal was radical in its simplicity. Remove the prisoner from other prisoners entirely. Give them a cell, a Bible, meaningful work to do with their hands, and silence. Let them think. Let them confront what they'd done. Let the conscience do what punishment alone could never accomplish. This philosophy took physical form on April 23, 1829, when Eastern State Penitentiary opened in Philadelphia. It was the largest and most expensive building in America at the time. Its architect, John Haviland, designed it with 7 cell blocks radiating outward from a central rotunda, like the spokes of a wheel, so that a single guard in the center could theoretically monitor every corridor. The cells were built with a small skylight in the ceiling, called the Eye of God, to let in a shaft of natural light. Each prisoner had an individual outdoor yard. The walls were thick stone. The doors were solid. And everything, from the moment you arrived to the moment you left, was silent. Not just quiet. Silent. Guards wore woolen socks over their shoes so their footsteps couldn't be heard in the corridors. Hoods were placed over prisoners' heads during transport between areas so they couldn't see, or be seen by, another inmate. Food was pushed through a small slot in the door. The only human contact permitted was with guards and a Protestant moral instructor, and even then, it was limited and formal. You could work in your cell. You could read the Bible. You could look up at the eye of God and think about what had brought you here. That was it. That was your life. For years. Sometimes for decades. The theory behind it was not cruel. It came from genuine moral conviction. The reformers who built Eastern State believed that every person had an inner conscience that had been drowned out by a life of bad influences, poverty, and criminal association. Remove all of that. Remove every other voice, every distraction, every social pressure, and the conscience would eventually speak. The prisoner would hear themselves think, perhaps for the first time. They would feel remorse. they would find God. They would leave not just punished, but transformed. What they didn't account for was what the human brain actually requires to function. Less than a decade after Eastern State opened, the prison's own records began documenting something troubling. Prisoners were breaking down. The annual reports of the Prison Discipline Society, the organization that had championed the Pennsylvania system, started containing entries that described inmates descending into what the physicians of the time called a distinct emotional instability. Fits of rage, uncontrollable weeping, the belief that unseen people were watching or following them. One prisoner's account, preserved in historical records, put it plainly. In the gloomy solitude of a sullen cell, there is not one redeeming principle. There is but one step between the prisoner and insanity. The guards saw it happening. The chaplains recorded it. The prison physicians wrote it up in their reports. And in 1833, just 4 years after Eastern State opened, the first major public scandal erupted, when a prisoner named Mathias Maccumsey died after prison officials used a torture instrument called the iron gag to enforce the silence rule. The iron gag fit over a prisoner's tongue like a horse's bit and attached to the arms pinned behind the back. Any movement caused the arms to pull the tongue. Maccumsey died from the injuries, and the man who ordered it faced almost no consequences, because the silence was that important to the people running the system. But here's what was happening simultaneously, about 300 miles away in New York. Auburn State Prison had opened in 1816 with a different philosophy. Its architects had watched the Pennsylvania system from a distance and made a practical adjustment. Total isolation was expensive. It required large, individual cells, constant supervision, and generated enormous psychological costs that had to be managed. Auburn's solution was a compromise. Keep prisoners isolated at night in their individual cells, but allow them to work together during the day, in groups, in silence. The silence was absolute, non-negotiable, enforced with the whip. Auburn's principal keeper, Elam Linz, a War of 1812 veteran who ran the prison with military precision, created his own version of the cat-o'-nine-tails, specifically for Auburn's disciplinary system. Any prisoner caught speaking was flogged immediately. Individuals who denied having spoken were flogged for lying. Guards removed their shoes at night and tiptoed along the cell blocks, pressing their ears to the walls, listening for whispers. During the day, prisoners moved between locations in what Linz called the lockstep, a single-file march with each man's hand on the shoulder of the man in front, heads turned toward the guard, eyes cast down. Not a word, not a gesture, not even eye contact. Linz believed, and stated explicitly, that the purpose of silence wasn't just discipline. It was psychological. He wanted to strip the prisoner of their sense of self, remove the social identity that came from being able to speak, to communicate, to be recognized by another person. A prisoner who couldn't talk, couldn't form alliances, couldn't plan resistance, couldn't build the kind of solidarity that made groups dangerous. They became, in Linz's framework, isolated individuals in a collective space, surrounded by other people and more alone than if they'd been in a cell by themselves. Auburn became the model. By the 1840s, most new American prisons were built on the Auburn plan, cheaper to construct than Eastern State, profitable through inmate labor, and apparently manageable. The system generated real money. Auburn reported a surplus of approximately $25,000 between 1828 and 1833, equivalent to roughly $500,000 today, through the products its silent prisoners manufactured: nails, barrels, shoes, carpets, steam engines. The silence wasn't just a moral philosophy, it had become an economic one. And then Charles Dickens arrived. In 1842, the most famous writer in the English-speaking world, visited Eastern State Penitentiary as part of his tour of America. Dickens was not an ideological opponent of prison reform. He understood the problems with the old system. But what he saw at Eastern State disturbed him profoundly. He wrote about it in his American Notes, a book that sold on both sides of the Atlantic, with language that has not lost its force in nearly 2 centuries. He called the Pennsylvania system a punishment that immures the victim in a living tomb. He wrote that the slow, daily tampering with the mysteries of the human brain was immeasurably worse than any torture of the body. He described watching prisoners who had been in isolation for years and found in their eyes something that he said he could not forget. A vacancy, a flatness, a quality that he struggled to name, but that he recognized as the loss of something essential. He said the system was cruel and wrong, and that he was certain, beyond any possibility of argument, that those who devised it meant it for kindness. The prison reformers hated the book. They attacked Dickens in pamphlets and public lectures. They accused him of sensationalism and misunderstanding the system's humane intent. But they couldn't dismiss what their own records showed. By the 1840s, the damage was impossible to deny. Prison physicians at Eastern State were documenting case after case of what we would today recognize as psychosis, developing in previously mentally healthy individuals. Paranoia, hallucinations, catatonia, self-harm. Men who had entered the prison functional and left it broken. Not by punishment, but by silence and time. The brain, it turned out, was not designed for silence. It was designed for other people. This is the part of the story that the reformers couldn't have known in 1829, but that we understand now with extraordinary precision. Human beings are the most socially dependent species on Earth. Not metaphorically, neurologically. The brain's reward and threat detection systems are calibrated around social input, around the presence, behavior, voices, and faces of other people. When that input disappears, the brain doesn't simply idle. It begins generating its own voices, patterns, presences that aren't there. It recalibrates its anxiety systems upward, because in the evolutionary environment in which the human brain developed, isolation almost always meant danger. To be separated from the group was to be in immediate risk of death. The stress response that isolation triggers isn't a malfunction. It's the system working exactly as designed, for an environment that no longer exists, in a building that was supposed to be humane. The reformers built Eastern State to let the conscience speak. What they actually created was a perfect machine for triggering the brain's most primitive danger alarms and leaving them running indefinitely with no way to shut off. Eastern State Penitentiary finally abandoned its Pennsylvania system in 1913, 84 years after it opened. Prisoners were allowed to share cells, work together, play organized sports. The silence rule collapsed under the weight of what its own records had been documenting for decades. According to Francis Dolan, a site manager of the Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site, the system was nearly impossible to maintain and collapsed under the weight of its own lofty morals. Auburn's silence rule similarly deteriorated across the latter half of the 19th century as overcrowding made enforcement impossible, and the evidence of psychological damage became harder to manage than the behavior the silence was designed to prevent. The prisons didn't ban silence because they found something more effective. They banned it because they couldn't keep pretending the damage wasn't happening. Eastern State Penitentiary closed in 1971, and today operates as a museum in Philadelphia, preserved in what it calls a state of sustained ruin. The cell blocks are still there. The Eye of God skylights still let in their narrow shafts of light. The feeding slots in the doors are still intact. More than 300,000 people visit every year, And many of them stand inside one of the individual cells and try to imagine what it would be like, not for days, but for years, to have that as the entire world. Most of them can't hold the image for more than a few seconds before they step back out into the corridor, back into the noise of other visitors, back into the ordinary, irreplaceable sound of other people moving through the world around them. The reformers of 1829 thought silence was a gift they were giving to broken people. They were half right about the brokenness. They were completely wrong about the cure. And the silence they built, the silence that was supposed to let the conscience speak, turned out to be the loudest possible demonstration of what happens when you take away the one thing the human brain cannot survive without. Not food, not light, not movement.